Besides Maine's 2nd congressional district, there's really only one remotely competitive seat in the House when it comes to New England, and that is the 5th congressional district in Connecticut. And that's going to be the focus of today's video because Republicans got incredibly close to flipping this House seat back in 2022, despite having a relatively poor performance around the country. So we're going to analyze how likely it is that this seat flips. I'll say right off the bat that I think the Democrats do have the upper hand here, but why potentially Republicans could snag this as a pickup in the House if they have a good night in November. So we're going to get to all of that, as well as looking at the district as a whole, its partisanship, in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So the 5th congressional district makes up most of northwestern Pennsylvania, as well as some suburbs around Hartford, Waterbury, Newtown, and this area around Waterbury that is somewhat of a pocket of Republican votes here. But ultimately, the district is Democratic leaning. If we go to the 2020 results, Joe Biden won this district by around 11 points. So this is definitely a likely Biden district right off the bat. I don't think many would argue that Joe Biden's in the strongest position right now. We had the debate, obviously, on Thursday night, and Joe Biden had a very weak performance. We talked about that in yesterday's video. But, you know, I think it's very likely that Donald Trump, or at least Joe Biden, is going to do worse in this district than he did in 2020. And that could potentially open the door to a Republican flip. Now, in 2022, Republicans recruited George Logan, who I believe is part of the state assembly. He's definitely more of a moderate Republican. He's not really in this sort of MAGA vein. He's more in this sort of New England centrist-y vein of Republican candidates. And that's really how you have to run in order to win a congressional seat in New England, because it's already very hard as a Republican to win federal office, whether it be for the House or even for the Senate. I mean, look at the state of New Hampshire, for example. New Hampshire routinely elects Republicans for governor, but you never really see, and you haven't seen, Republicans get elected to the House there since 2014. So it's been about a decade since New England has had Republican representation outside of the state of Maine. And now, of course, Republicans have no congressional seats in New England as a whole. And while Maine's 2nd congressional district with Jared Golden is obviously the first go-to for Republicans in terms of the most flippable seats, this is certainly not a seat I would ignore in 2024. Like I said before, Joe Biden is likely to do worse in this congressional district than he did back in 2020. George Logan was a decently strong candidate. Obviously, he did have his own problems, and, you know, he wasn't ultimately able to drive it home. But he did only lose this election by around 2,000 votes, or less than a percentage point. So already right off the bat, he's done better here than other previous Republicans. Now, the district really hasn't changed all that much. If we look at the change from 2020 to 2022, there was only a 0.1% move in the favor of Democrats, which is basically negligible. Now, if we go back to the 2022 House elections, Jahana Hayes, the incumbent Democrat, won here by a little less than 12 percentage points. So she ran a little bit ahead of Joe Biden. Now, George Logan is very likely to be the nominee this time around. Taking a look at the fundraising in the district, he's already raised around a little under $500,000 as of December 31st of last year. Hannah Hayes is obviously going to have a cash advantage being an incumbent Democrat in a blue district with $1.2 million raised. Now, obviously, these fundraising numbers are out of date, and we'll probably get more updated fundraising numbers as the election goes on, but clearly Democrats do have the geographical advantage here. I mean, if you take a look at the makeup of the district, like I pointed out earlier, you've got cities like Newtown, Danbury, Waterbury, New Britain. These are all very Democratic leaning areas. Newtown previously had voted Republican in 2012 and has since sort of leaned more Democratic. But more broadly speaking, obviously the population centers in this district are Democratic. But what you'll notice is you have a lot of these little rural pockets that really don't have a whole lot of people in them, but are very, very blue. And this is very reminiscent of Vermont or even rural Massachusetts. And it's really sort of a New England phenomenon where you have these very white, rural, but very liberal rural enclaves, which you really don't see anywhere else in the country. I mean, Hawaii in some areas is very remote and rural, but the demographics of Hawaii are vastly different than the demographics of New England. And part of the reason why New England has these sort of blue rural areas is because the population is far more socially liberal and far more highly educated. There's a lot more college graduation rates here. And obviously college grads tend to be a lot more liberal than the average population. As a result, you have these sort of random blue pockets all across New England. And these areas had previously voted Republican back in the 1980s, just like the rest of the region. And really since 1992, that's when you saw a massive shift in the voting patterns of these municipalities. But looking ahead at 2024, if we go back to 2016, Donald Trump came the closest to winning the 5th congressional district of any Republican federally since 1988. And he only lost this district by 4 points against Hillary Clinton. And part of the reason why he got so close is because there was a massive swing in Donald Trump's direction in Litchfield County, which was the only county to vote for Mitt Romney back in 2012 in Connecticut, and only one of 2 counties to vote for Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2018, the other being on the opposite side of the state in the Northeast, Windham County. So that district is also probably the second most competitive in Connecticut, but obviously when you compare the two, that's the 2nd congressional district. It actually voted more closely than the 5th congressional district, but Joe Courtney, the incumbent Democrat, is much stronger, in my opinion, than somebody like Jahana Hayes, who almost lost her seat back in 2022. If you look at the 2022 midterms in the 2nd congressional district, you had a very different story. The Democrats really didn't have any problem holding onto the seat. Joe Courtney ended up winning re-election by 18 points. So even though the 2nd congressional district, in theory, should be easier for the Republicans to capture, it's really the 5th congressional district that is just more reachable. Now, part of that is because George Logan was a much better candidate than somebody like Mike France, for example. But you still have to understand that in New England in general, it's very hard for Republicans to break through federal office. Now, the only reason I think Democrats really have a chance at all of losing this seat is because Biden is likely to do worse in the rural parts of the state. As we talked about earlier, you do have these socially liberal rural pockets in the northwestern part of the state, but you also have red areas across the district. And the district overall is more rural than the other CDs around the state. And that is a benefit for the Republican Party. Now, again, Donald Trump is likely to probably capture more of these municipalities than he did, obviously, in 2020. If we go back to 2016, you see the geography is much redder, and that's the reason why Donald Trump almost won the 2nd congressional district and came pretty close in the 5th as well. It's because a lot of these rural municipalities that had previously voted for Obama in 2008, 2012, swung pretty big towards Donald Trump, and that's why these 2 counties, Litchfield and Windham, swung very big in Donald Trump's direction. It's because of these rural pockets that swung double digits towards the Republican Party. Now, it's interesting because in previous elections, we would be talking about the 4th congressional district being very competitive, but this district has swung massively towards the left in just the past 2 election cycles. You go back to 2012, Barack Obama only won this district by, I believe, 10 points. And obviously, fast forward to 2020, and Joe Biden's winning this district by 29 points under the old map, 30 under the new map. So you've seen a massive shift in the Republican coalition in Connecticut. Previously, Republicans had typically done better in the southwestern portion of the state, the New York suburbs, places like Greenwich, New Canaan, Darien. These were all Republican voting municipalities. And really all across Fairfield County, you had much more Republican support than you do in 2016 and again in 2020. Now, if you look at 2020, there's basically no red municipalities. Compare that, of course, to 2020, where you have New Canaan and Darien, for example, voting for Mitt Romney by over 60 percentage points each. And then, of course, obviously in 2016, they're voting for Hillary Clinton by double digits. So you saw massive swings in this part of the state, but the trade-off was Republicans did better in this portion of the state, the Northwest and the Northeast. And obviously, if you look at this map, the northeastern part of Connecticut is much, much bluer than it was in 2016, back in 2012. And fast forward to 2024, I think Donald Trump has a decent chance at flipping a lot of these municipalities back. Now, granted, I think he's probably going to do worse in this portion of the state. Again, it's very wealthy, moderate in general. That's one of the reasons why it backed Mitt Romney but didn't back Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. But this congressional district is probably one of the more rural ones besides the 2nd, and that's one of the reasons why I think this ultimately could be a flip opportunity. Now, as I mentioned, it's going to be a rematch. Typically, rematches don't fare well for the opponent. You know, Jahana Hayes held on to her seat very narrowly back in 2022. That was obviously a more favorable environment for Republicans than 2020, but certainly isn't the best environment they could have asked for. Obviously, in 2024, you're going to have higher turnout all across the state. That could potentially benefit Hayes, as you're going to have higher turnout in sort of these bluer pockets of the district, places like New Britain, Danbury, Waterbury, places that are voting for Democrats by double digits. You're probably going to see higher turnout there, but you could potentially see Republicans, George Logan in particular, do better in the rural parts of the state. Again, this all really depends on how Donald Trump performs in Connecticut as a whole. If he's bringing Connecticut down to 15, 14 percentage points, I think you could potentially see a flip opportunity here under the same circumstances. But as it's looking right now, Donald Trump's probably still going to lose the state by around 16, 17 points. And I think even in the 5th Congressional District, which is probably more Republican friendly than any other part of the state, you're probably going to see Jahana Hayes hold on. But again, this obviously is a stretch for Republicans to win here. I don't think that's going to happen at this point in time, but I figured I would talk about it because it's really the only other competitive seat in New England, and New England's often an area overlooked when we talk about the national picture, because for the most part, it's not really that competitive, but when you dive deep, the politics of this area are a lot more interesting and differ greatly from the rest of the country, especially when you consider that places like Vermont, for example, and Massachusetts up until recently had Republican governors, and Vermont still has a Republican governor running for another term, and he's probably going to win by a landslide. So that'll be the topic for another video, but that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts down below. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.